twist things a bit, but
no problem. We are
that's
self-organizing.
fine.
Whatever great
Right.
result
Okay,
you generate is fine.
Right. Okay. Let me just share my screen and I get my. Okay. So it's a bit difficult, really. I think there are some very serious points that Klaus raises in the text that he sent round, and in a way, I think that one of the challenges that we've got in cybernetics is to try and get back to the original motivation or the motivations in cybernetics, which is very much about a sort of playful engagement with technology. If you think about the kind of ontological theatre that Andrew Pickering talks about, this sort of engagement with technologies. And so I've got some technologies here, which I'm going to talk about as I move through. I'm going to say something about AI. I'm going to say something about quantum computers, because I think they're very interesting. And I'm going to say something about musical instruments. And, I've got Ashby's homeostat there, because I kind of think that there was something very important and much deeper happening in that practical engagement. And if we can recover some of that, I think we would be in a better position, both in the social impact of cybernetics and in our own sort of discourse with one another. I want to start, though, by saying something about musical instruments and music in particular, because it's going to run through everything else I'm going to say, and it's about pattern and redundancy. So I'm just going to give you a little example, because I've got my piano here, and I'm just going to play some chords, which is they're chords from a piece of music by Bach. Well, it's not very interesting, but of course, we talk about Bach's music particularly being complex. And one of the things that Klaus is sort of driving at is that the metaphor of complexity is a problem. I quite agree. And I've always felt this, because music isn't complex in the way that, say, Ashby seems to describe a complex system with a number of states and so on. The variety of the system is the number of possible states. What does Bach actually do? So he takes these chords and he overlays them with multiple descriptions of those chords, multiple descriptions of the same thing. So here's one. Which is kind of interesting, but then he adds another one, and his whole musical language is built up like this. So here we go. Okay, I can't do it, but you get the idea. And I think this overlaying of multiplicity, this overlaying of multiple description, is something that is particularly noticeable in some of the technologies that we are seeing emerging now, particularly in AI and quantum computing. I'm going to talk about why those things are particularly interesting. Just as a matter of interest, oh no, that's interesting. Just as a matter of interest, a friend of mine has just written this book, and it's really an evolutionary history of music. And I think it would be of interest to some people here. It's particularly profound. I think if you're going to look at the social problems that we have at the moment, then Shakespeare would recognize them. And there's a very famous speech that Shakespeare has Ulysses utter in Troilus and Cressida about degree. And he says, when degree is shaked, which is the ladder to all high designs, then the enterprise is sick. Well, I think that is pretty much where we are, isn't it? And, you know, he talks, how good communities, degrees in schools and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogenitive and due of birth, prerogative of age, crowns, scepters, laurels, but by degree stand in authentic place. This is important. You know, you just can't go wrong with Shakespeare. It's very interesting. And I find it very interesting that he draws on the musical metaphor. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. I think this is very powerful. And the musical, the instrumental thing here, the metaphor, is incredibly important. I think it is, you know, we make sense of the world through these tools, through our engagement with these things in our material environment and our experimentation. Now, I think there are cybernetic problems, both about degree and proportion and about complexity. And I think there are four which I'm summarizing here. First of all, I think, although there are many people who've talked about time and circularity, and I think of the people I'm particularly keen on, Nicholas Goodman is very profound on this. But I think that this is not widely understood about the nature of time and how time is part of observation and so on. I think there's a problem of aboutness and meaning, and particularly as aboutness relates to information theory or our conceptions of information theory. I think that's got very much to do with redundancy and pattern and anticipation, which is very closely related to Lote's work. I think a much more profound problem is that we make assumptions about the ergodicity of the systems that we work with. We see this particularly in data analytics at the moment. And when I say we, I'm not saying cyberneticians. They're much too well informed to make assumptions about living systems being ergodic. But there's a huge amount of categorical mistakes being made in terms of the way we approach data analysis, assuming living systems, social systems are ergodic. That means that you take one chunk of them and do some sort of statistical operation or a measurement of information and make assumptions that that amount of information applies, the pattern applies across a much longer time stretch. And of course, we know that living systems aren't like that. They have emergence, they grow their alphabet, they increase their maximum entropy. And I think one of the most interesting problems, and one that really touches on physics, is the problem of coherence and whether the organizational forms that we see around us arrive by accident, by some sort of stochastic process, or whether there is some deeper patterning going on, perhaps derived from physics. And this is where quantum computing and AI are particularly interesting, because they do seem to be suggesting that there is some kind of patterning and that we aren't accidents. And I know John Torday gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, which I was also part of that session, and I agree with him. This is not an accident. We are not accidents. Now, just coming back to more standard cybernetics in a way, I think it's interesting to think about our relation to tools. And this is central. It's probably absolutely central to some of the social problems that we have. We have environments of high complexity. I know this is really basic, but you know, a swamp, an environment of very high complexity, a spider, an organism of much lower complexity, much lower variety. And you know what's in between here. So we've got some process of selection of the environment. So the spider has to select what's important in the environment. You know, the information that it can absorb and ignore stuff that it feels isn't relevant to it. And there must be a process of amplification. And I suppose one of the insights that I've drawn particularly recently is the relationship between amplification and redundancy. You know, the spider does its amplification by repeating what it knows, and what it knows is how to spin a web, and through spinning a web, it creates a niche for itself. So this is the amplification of the organism's representation of its environment. And if this gets out of kilter, it doesn't work. The organism dies. It can't manage its variety. Now, of course, what we're seeing increasingly is our technologies are doing all of these functions. So we're seeing our technologies being used for selection, particularly. You all had to click on a link and sign into a form to get into Zoom. And we're doing that all the time. That's what technology is being used to do. It's an attenuation of variety. But also technology is very good at amplifying its own representations of the world. So, you know, we've got immensely powerful visual analytics that our technology is able to do, represent visual, new, powerful representations of reality, which are quite useful to us. So both these processes, amplification and attenuation, are working together. But we've still got these institutions that are hanging around and saying, all of this complexity is rather threatening to us. So we're going to attenuate the variety of the organism and say, no, you can't, you've got to do it in a particular way. And this seems to be where we are, that the metasystemic problem, the metasystem kind of takes over the whole thing, and we become very stiff and unadaptive. And that is a large part of the difficult problems that we have at the moment. Now, it's very interesting that people have been aware of this. Now, Stafford Beer was particularly aware of this, and you know, the pathology of the metasystem is in the top part of this diagram. I mean, he drew these diagrams in Platform for Change, which is a wonderful book. I just think it's probably the most important book that Beer wrote, and it's very interesting. If you have a look at just one of these, I'm looking at the Homo faber box here on the far left-hand side. So you have an organizational entity, which is basically a distinction. And within that distinction, there is uncertainty, because there is always uncertainty about any distinction. What belongs inside the distinction, what exists outside. You have to have that. And your metasystem is the thing that sits outside and mops up that uncertainty. And Beer's point is that in the old institutions that we have, the metasystem is the problem. The metasystem is the thing that attenuates our ability to adapt. And so his diagrams are really showing how the relationship between the system and the metasystem might be restructured. But look, what doesn't he do? This is the interesting thing. And this is the sort of, because I mean, where he goes, the picture he paints about the future is fantastic. It's wonderful. More people should know about it. But look at this. This is the problem. How do you get from where we are to where we want to be? Well, it's not specified. It's not clear. And I think that is something that we've got to think about now, because we're obviously in a not very desirable situation. We may all have ideas about where we want to go from here, but how we actually implement the changes, how we manifest those changes is hard to envisage. And it's almost always envisaged in a linear fashion. And linearity is not very cybernetic as far as I can see. Now, one way of dealing with this is to think, well, actually, what we've got is a sort of evolving relationship of different expectations of the world. And that's what I'm just showing here, that in a sense, over time, obviously events happen, there are different structurings of events that happen, and there is interference between the temporal flow of events and particular structures at particular times. And this interference might be represented as a kind of fractal, or in the language of perhaps Robert Rosen, or even particularly Daniel Dubois, I think it's an anticipatory system. It must be a fractal. Any system that anticipates must be fractal. So what we're doing in the process of implementation is engaging in some kind of coordination of anticipatory structures. And that, it seems to me, is a more circular way of thinking about how we move from A to B. I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a second. I think if we can do this, then we can start to look at problems of implementation as more circular type problems, more cybernetic problems, more cybernetic way of thinking about things. I'm just bringing up my Möbius strip there because I was very proud of it last time I used it. I think teaching is perhaps one of the clearest examples you can get of what I might mean by circular implementation. Just think what we have with teaching. We have an individual who draws a distinction. This is who I am. And within that distinction, there is some uncertainty. Is this who I am? Or which parts of the environment do I actually include as part of myself, and which parts do I exclude? Where is the boundary drawn? So there must be a metasystemic function which absorbs some of that uncertainty. And there must be also, within that metasystem, an awareness that the uncertainty is not just within the distinction or the person that's made, but also within the environment, which is equally uncertain. And there must be then ways of managing that relationship between the outside and balancing it with the inside. And we end up with something that looks pretty much like Beer's VSM. I know there are bits missing, but you get the idea. And of course, this isn't just one individual, one person doing this. This is a conversation. And I think it's a conversation which is taking place within a shared technological and epigenetic environment. And if the conversation is a good one, then it will cause people to restructure their metasystemic functions, which may cause them to be rigid in the way that they see the world and start to open up to the uncertainties and express the uncertainties, be creative. I think a lot of our creativity is related to us expressing our uncertainties and sharing them with each other. This is what I would love the education system to be, particularly. And it is a process of circular implementation. So, just as a summary, exploiting uncertainty for environmental interventions, creating conditions for conversation through technological ambiguity, and reconfiguring the interface between the self and the world. Just mentioning Gilbert Simondon, because I think Gilbert Simondon's ideas around, first of all, transduction, which is basically describes what each of these processes is doing, and individuation, I think he was spot on. It's not work that's well known in cybernetics, but certainly the sociologists have picked it up very, very much. And Beer, of course, understood these problems of circularity and implementation. I think that was a large part of the thinking behind his syntegration. But the syntegration still, it doesn't deal with implementation, it just pushes it back. So you've got to implement a syntegration then. So, there's some more thinking to be done here. What I do think is interesting in syntegration is the interest that Beer had in the work of George Kelly. And personal construct theory is very interesting because a personal construct is an anticipatory system. It's all about anticipation. Kelly is really a fascinating thinker. Now, what about when things go wrong? Well, we know about this stuff, don't we? We know about our institutions, our families, and all sorts of social situations are full of double binds. They're full of incompatible intentions. And I think it's interesting to sort of think, okay, so what is the double bind in our sort of our organizational contexts? Maybe it is actually a sort of conflict of anticipatory systems. So, if you have someone in a double bind, so there's a metasystemic thing that's saying, imposing something, you must do this. The organism is basically caught because they're struggling to work out, well, what are you asking me to do? I can't figure this out. And I certainly can't figure it out in relation to the environment. So which anticipatory model do you use? You can't, you're oscillating in that position. But I think this is my last slide. I think there is hope here. And I think this is where we should be doing some experimentation, because the technologies which are emerging very fast now are, first of all, let's talk about the AI very quickly. The AI is not artificial intelligence as we saw in the 1980s and 90s. This is doing something different. And it is basically, it is an anticipatory system and it's fractal. If you want to know how fractal it is, you can look up the Deep Dream images. So basically Deep Dream was the Google engineers running their convolutional neural networks in reverse and getting the neural network to actually reconfigure pictures to take the form that would make the machine learning able to recognize them. So you basically give it noise and you say, turn this picture into something that you recognize as a fish or as an eye or whatever. And it does some really beautiful and quite weird things. And that's the closest we can get to actually understanding what's happening in particularly the convolutional neural networks. You can see that they're fractals by just looking at the pattern of how the thing works. It works in layers. Now, what's interesting about the the AI that we currently have is that it's taking its data from the world around us, from what David Bohm would call the explicate order. Now, if you want to look at pattern in a different way, if you want to look at fractals in a different way, then perhaps we should be looking at our quantum computers, because they're doing almost the same thing. They're generating pattern, but they're generating pattern from physics. They're generating pattern from what David Bohm would call the implicate order. And I think there's something very important here about individuals being given tools to anticipate their environment in a much more profound way, so that they can loosen their reliance on a sort of metasystemic imposition, and so that the metasystem itself can reconfigure itself to actually provide a much more supportive environment for personal coordination. So I think that's probably quite a bearish thing to say, but what I really want to say is, for God's sake, look at our technologies. It's a very exciting and important time, and I think we should be cyberneticians and be doing some more experiments. That's it.
Can you give an example of such an experiment?
Yes. So I've been doing something in the medical faculty in Liverpool, and one of the challenges of machine learning is that basically you get an answer.
Yeah.
And in fact, I wonder if I can even demonstrate this. Let's. Have you got time? Can I do this, Jason?
Yes, of course. Klaus is not here, so you each got a half of his time.
I want to show you something cool.
Please.
Works. Right, here we go. Right, yeah, there we go. Okay, let me share my screen again. Okay, so I've been working with working with the Iron Vision Science department. Now, we've been looking at ways of using AI to automatically diagnose a condition called diabetic retinopathy. Now, I've got an example here of a standard approach. This is a standard machine approach to doing automatic disease recognition. And I'm going to give it an image. And I'm going to send it to a machine learning service which has been trained, I'll say something about the training, to identify whether the image has got diabetic retinopathy or not. And what it does is it gives you a probability of two categories. It's either got diabetic retinopathy or it hasn't. And it thinks this particular example has. Now, what's involved in the training is basically a recursive algorithm, which is the machine learning model, is presented with huge amounts of redundancy in terms of images, and those images are classified, and the processing is all done with redundancy. It takes, as you probably know, it takes a huge amount of data to actually effectively train a machine learning model, and the things don't allow you to inspect what's actually happening behind the scenes. So what we've done is something slightly different. So we've, instead of actually having one category of saying it's got disease or no disease, we've, let's just do this. On this. I don't know, just upload the same image. This is doing repeated comparisons. So I'm going to send this to a different kind of machine learning service. And what this does is it opens out the uncertainty. So you remember I said the important thing is to exploit the uncertainty. And if you can exploit the uncertainty, then you create the conditions for conversation and interaction. So I'm going to send this to a machine learning service, which is now going to compare this image to 88 images of increasing severity. It takes a bit longer because obviously it's doing more work. But what we end up with is a binary pattern, effectively. And that binary pattern identifies where the machine learning is unsure about its particular diagnosis. And I'll come back in a minute.
It's doing a calculation.
Yeah, well, I'll show you what it's done in a minute. Now, the machine learning is actually not that clever, particularly when it's looking at very complex and very similar looking images. And you can see this has been through a process and it's tried to rank this image within those 88 images that it's got, but it's not done very well. It thinks it's more than 25 and it's less than 77. But we can inspect this in more detail. So it's all of these icons here represent scans at different orders of complexity, different orders of severity, I should say. You can see no retinopathy, yeah? As it goes through, it gradually the images get more severe, and eventually it starts to think, actually, I think the image that you just presented here is, this image is more severe than the one that you're presenting. But then it goes on to the next one and it thinks, no, I'm not sure. And then it thinks, oh yes, no, it is. No, I'm not sure. You get the idea? So the overall uncertainty really ranges from here to here. And so that's interesting. So that starts to, and when you look at these pictures, you start to think, okay, well, that I can see why it's made that mistake. You can look at this one, you know, it's quite easy to see why that's made that mistake. But then what we've done is to say, let's see what humans think. Let's see what humans think about this particular diabetic patient. And I'm just going to show you how that works very quickly. So I basically, as a human being, I've been given a task, and basically I'm asked to make comparisons between those cases where the machine learning is unsure. So this is where you would have a group of people start to have a conversation about, well, what do you think? Do you think the image on the left is more severe than the image on the right? Well, actually, I think it probably is. I'm not not complete expert on this. I do know something about it now. And I'm just going to go through this very quickly. I think that's still more severe. Let's have a look. Yeah, they're almost the same, but I'm still going to keep with that. What about this? Maybe we're getting slightly more serious. Almost certainly is. And so I'm not taking this terribly seriously, as you can see, because I just want to get through it. But once I've done this, and I'll submit it, and now you'll see that my the results of my process are a refined ranking. And can you see it now thinks, no, it's at position 30. So this is what I mean by that experiments in terms of actually finding the best ways and the most effective ways in which we can use the uncertainty generated by technology to coordinate the conversations between human beings. That's what it is. Does that make sense?
Yes, Mark, that makes a lot of good sense, that the machine as a machine can be used to classify mechanical figures, mechanical patterns that the machine has been recognized from the past. And this is all very, very mechanical. I don't see, and I understand why physicians would find this very useful in classifying retinopathies. And it's certainly beneficial, I would think, for the patient and the public health in general. That's the upside of it. The downside is that I see no relationship in it to either category theory in terms of mathematics or in terms of biology, the basic underlying points of biology. So mathematics as metaphor is what I see in these images. So the question then that comes to mind is, what is the nature of representation for cybernetics and cyberneticians? How do we represent nature? And what are the mechanisms, or I shouldn't say mechanisms, what is the logical inclusions and exclusions that lead to such representations?
Okay, well, I think there are a number of things to unpick there. I mean, category theory is, well, that is a form of representation, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's not the only one. But I think the word I would pick up is logic, because I've come back to my musical example, and what I'm saying is that the complexity of music is not in some sort of logical relation of possible states. It's in the relation of the interference between multiple descriptions of things. Now, that's a slightly different way of looking at logic. It's to say that actually our understanding of true and false, of correctness and illusion, is something that's perhaps more complex than we like to imagine. Our conception of logic is a metasystemic attenuation. And that leads us into problems, I think.
Because it is a logic and not a calculus.
Yes, that's right.
Are we separating the notion of calculus from logic? I mean, this would be remarkable.
I would mean to say that you need a time to account for time. So
yes,
what may be true at one moment, maybe not
absolutely
true at the next moment.
Yes.
Yes, and let's look at that notion of time from the notion of a musical composition, where the notion of time in a musical composition, obviously you have different time duration of notes, but each individual note is necessary as a logical entity to compose the musical composition into the patterns that you desire, or that the pattern the composer wishes to communicate.
I don't know what you mean by logic, though.
Pardon?
I don't know what you mean by logic in that sense.
Well, I'm referring actually to natural deductions. I'm not referring to set theory.
Yeah, but that's not the way.
Just natural deductions of relevance to the representation of the terms, such that you can draw conclusions. So the necessity for logical terms to be relevant to the conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, the conclusion of most composers is that they die. In fact, that's the conclusion of most of this.
Oh, that's cruel.
But music stops. That's really important. Music doesn't go on forever. It comes to a conclusion.
It's still around.
I think we have to be very, very careful with this stuff, because in a sense, your emphasis on logic will lead you into precisely the kind of problems that I was talking about, particularly the problem of ergodicity. I think we cannot assume a logical, ergodic universe. It's not like that.
I do not like the term ergodic in this context.
Well, I can understand.
This is part of your assumption. This is part of your assumptions of your system of thought, is to avoid ergodicity.